Welcome to Awesome Paints, people. My name is Awesome, and I like to 3D print and paint nerd stuff. Today, we have one of my personal favorite Pokemon, Aggron. I'm going to show you guys how easy it is to make your own amazing Pokemon figures.
It's false. No way. Not this time.
Well, easy might be a bit misleading. There's a good amount of work and skill involved in making this, but the steps to get here are simple enough and straightforward. Hopefully, this video gives you guys some confidence to try it out yourself if you're able. Let's start. Firstly, we'll need a digital 3D model to actually print. My go-to for Pokemon models is cgtrader.com. You can just search Pokemon here and see they pretty much have everything made by different artists. Here's a great diorama display that would be cool to make, but this commission is just the single Aggron. We'll then import the model to a slicer program. I'm using Chitubox. If you didn't know, the way resin 3D printers work is by curing one layer after another until the entire model is complete. The purpose of a slicer program is to basically slice the model into a bunch of layers. The most important part of using a slicer is adding supports, as you can see me doing now. Supports are required in certain areas, so there's something to hold onto for the layers to cure to, as you can't just print stuff in midair. It needs to be attached to the build plate or attached to something attached to the build plate. Supports can be a fairly confusing process for beginners, so let me know if you guys are interested in seeing a detailed video on it. Took me about 30 minutes to manually add all the supports to this model. That means every stick you see is a deliberate click on my mouse. We then slice the file, pop it onto a flash drive, then into the printer, and a few hours later, thanks to my efficient supports, we have a couple successful prints. I didn't film this for the Aggron pieces, but since the parts are covered in resin, which is toxic by the way, hence why I'm wearing gloves, we need to thoroughly clean it off. I use my ultrasonic cleaner filled with degreaser to get most of the resin off. The liquid is also heated to about 45 degrees Celsius, and this softens the supports considerably, making it super easy to just pry off the supports from the model. I'll then give it a second cleaning, throw it in my homemade ultraviolet chamber for a little bit in order to completely cure it. I'm moving quickly through these steps, so if you'd like to see a more detailed video on my process, let me know. Or perhaps I'll save that for my Patreon if I ever get any patrons there.
Give me money. Money me. Money now. Me a money needing a lot now.
Alright, now we have the figure and we're ready to paint it.
How about new?
You can't see it on camera that well, but the surface isn't perfect. While layer lines aren't an issue like on regular FDM printers, there's still some called voxels. Personally, while I try to get rid of as much of these as possible, I don't mind if they bleed through the end result, as it adds a bit of character in my eyes that this is in fact 3D printed, a very cool feat of the marvelous engineering. And sanding sucks. But what I definitely want to get rid of are these holes that were necessary for hollowed prints to print properly, except the ones that don't matter, like the ones at the bottom. There's many different ways to fill this, but what I like to do is simply reuse my 3D print resin for this purpose, preferably clear resin. Here I have a small jar of it. I'll take a brush and simply brush over the hole. This method only works for holes that aren't too big, and what I'm trying to do is make a bubble through surface tension inside the hole. I'll then take my UV flashlight and shine it on this thin bridge of resin, hardening it in seconds. This will now allow me to fill the hole with UV resin without it dripping inside. I'll do this in multiple thin layers, making sure it's thoroughly cured by shining it with UV light for a good 15 seconds. Can we paint it once the holes are filled?
Incorrect.
If we do, it'll be an obvious bump once painted, so we need to sand it flush with the rest of the surface. You can do this using a variety of sanding tools. Here I have a carved file, but what I switched over to was this super cool Minning sanding belt. I'm using a low grit as the cured resin is super smooth, so we'll need something to really bite down on it to rough up the surface to make sanding easier. Once I get it mostly shaved, I'll take my sanding sponge and finish the rest of the way, making it nice and smooth. Also, the thing I'm sanding over is a nail dust collector, but even though it's collecting most of the resin, I'm still wearing a dust mask. Resin dust is toxic to inhale, but the actual print is safe to handle since we cured it thoroughly. Also, for any of the random equipment and whatnot you see throughout the video, I'll go ahead and leave some links in the description below of things that I use or recommend. One great tool I have is this handy little table vise. Clamp down the part and you can free up both hands to get to spots way more effectively.
1 hour later.
Alright, holes are sanded smooth. Can we paint?
Come on, man.
I'm going to permanently attach the tail to the body since we don't want a random line running through our paint job. I scuffed up each side for maximum adhesion, and I'll use this 2-part epoxy resin to glue this together. Simply mix it up for a minute, lather it on, and you're good to go. Unfortunately, this stuff needs to be clamped down as it takes a few hours to really get hard.
That's what she said.
An easy way to clamp down awkward shapes is rubber bands. I'll use a few to get a good amount of pull, try to set them up so they're squeezing all sides evenly, and leave it for a bit to let it set up.
2 hours later.
Now that it's been sitting for a bit, it should be good to handle. The joint isn't perfect, so I'll fill it with UV resin like I did the holes, then sand the surface smooth. And now, with all that work done, we can finally paint. I'm using Mr. Hobby 1000 Surfacer, a great hobby paint that gives a really smooth finish. This is a primer, which will allow further paint layers to adhere to the surface. Unfortunately, priming often reveals imperfections in the surface that were missed during the first stages of sanding, so that means more sanding.
I just can't do it. I can't.
Alright, so the term easy might be a little clickbaity, sue me, I'm trying to grow the channel. In addition to those layer lines we talked about, there were also support marks I missed that I want to clean up. This is a commission for a client, so I'm making sure it's good quality work, which takes some TLC. I'm using Bondo Spot Putty to help smooth the surface where the layer lines or little dimples from support marks were. I'll sand all this down, smooth it, and prime it once again. In typical newbie YouTuber fashion, I lost the footage of me repriming this and painting the dark grays, so just use your imagination. So this is a really simple color scheme, literally just 2 grays. You can mask off all the dark gray areas with tape, then airbrush the lighter gray, but I'm lazy, so we're going to hand brush it on. Hand brushing is not as easy as it looks to get a good result. You need to thin your paint down to a certain degree. I'd recommend looking up miniature paint tutorials, as those guys know how to hand paint. I'm just going to carefully paint on the light grays in one light coat, taking care not to go too close to the edges. I'll then come back with a finer brush and paint the very edges. See how patchy the paint looks? That's normal. Don't try and get full coverage in just one coat. Do multiple thin coats. Also, I'm painting a lighter color over a darker color, which will take even more coats. I think I painted over all the light grays 3 or 4 times. If you didn't know, Aggron is a steel-type Pokemon, so you might be inclined to paint him in metallic paints. Initially, I did paint the gray body in metallic, and I didn't like it at all. It was way too over the top. So instead, I'm just going to dry brush some metallics over the plain grays to give a subtle metallic shine to the paint. Dry brushing is where you pretty much brush all the paint off your brush onto a paper towel or something, till there's barely any left. Then you sweep the brush quickly across the surface. This will especially highlight the edges of the part, which is typically what this technique is used for. I'll do the same for the rest of the body using a flat brush. This is a really fun technique as it's super easy to do and instantly makes your paint job look amazing. It's hard to see through the camera since it's subtle, but it's really giving life to an otherwise basic paint job. After the metallics, I took some black chalk pastels and brushed them into the crevices of the body to add some shadow. I lost this footage too, so here's me pretending to do it again.
What can I do anything right?
Alright, this bad boy's almost done. I'll mix some red to different shades to paint the roof of the mouth and the tongue. I'll then fill in those black holes and paint the eyes blue. Here's a cool tip for filling in thin black lines easily, which my Gunpla fans will know well. Use Tamiya Black Panel Liner. I'll just carefully touch the tip of the brush to the eye line, and through capillary action, the paint will flow into the line very nicely. But wait, now there's a black mark ruining the eye.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine.
Well, that's the beauty of this product. It's an enamel paint, so using an enamel thinner to gently scrub off the mark won't at all affect the acrylic paint underneath. Finally, to protect all my paintwork, I'll spray it down with a matte varnish. While gloss coats have their place, it would make this figure look way too much like a toy as opposed to a display model. Once it's dry, we're done, and here's the final result. I'm really happy how this turned out. Notice how most of this video was not painting. That's the one downside, I guess you can say, of this hobby. For me, painting is the most enjoyable part, whereas all that sanding and prep work, which occupies most of your time, can get pretty tedious pretty quickly. But I think the result is worth all that work. Anyway, that'll be it for this video, guys. If you enjoyed, it would mean a lot to me if you could subscribe and like, as I'm trying to grow the channel. I'm currently working through a lot of old commissions, but please leave your suggestions on what you'd like to see me make next. Until next time, take care.